at the midway. We're at the midway point of the legislative session. So we're grateful to host this webinar today and be joined by some of Vermont's leading experts and advocates in their field for an update on some of the top priorities of Vermont's environmental community. As you may recall, in January, the Vermont Conservation voters rolled out the 2026 Vermont Environmental Common Agenda, which is a document that outlines the top legislative priorities of 22 Vermont nonprofits and the priorities that they share on clean energy and climate, smart growth housing and conservation, better transportation options, toxic-free communities, and a healthy work democracy. So today we're going to get an update on where things stand on those key priorities, again, at the halfway point of the legislative session. So we're going to go through a series of speakers, and then we're going to aim to end the conversation today with some time for Q&A. So if you have questions for our panelists, please drop your questions in the chat, and we're going to get to as many as possible. And at the end, we're hoping to also offer some ideas for what you can do to help advance further policy progress on these issues this legislative session before the session wraps. So to start it off in just 1 minute, I'm going to turn it over to Adam McGeary, who is a staff attorney and policy expert at the Conservation Law Foundation, to discuss what's happening or what's not on clean energy and climate policy. After Adam, we're going to hear from VNRC's Sustainable Communities Program Director, Katie Gallagher, who's going to describe efforts afoot around smart growth, good land use policy, and what's happening in the transportation arena this session in the legislature. Then we're going to wrap with several important issues related to climate resilience, food security, toxics, and democracy. Not a toxic democracy, but toxics and democracy, with Vermont Conservation Voters Political Director Justin Marsh. So we've got a lot to cover, and again, want to get to your questions and get your thoughts on engagement opportunities. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Adam McGeary, the Conservation Law Foundation, to talk about clean energy and climate action efforts this session. Thank you so much, Adam.
Yeah, thanks, Joey, for that introduction. It's good to be here. I'm going to jump right in. I work in our climate and energy program, and just a little bit about CLF. We have an office here in Montpelier, but also have offices in all the New England states. So we bring both a state and a regional perspective, and so have a lot of regional partners from which we draw expertise. And so I'm bringing that here to this presentation. So next slide, please. We can talk generally. There are three major themes that kind of come along this legislative session. The first is affordability. That's no surprise to anybody. Affordability is the currency of the realm. We are looking at how legislation impacts Vermonters in all ways. I'm sure all of you are following that debate in many different sectors and many different industries, but that is also true here in the climate and energy space. We're also thinking about data and measurement. So we're thinking about how do we measure emissions? How do we measure the success of programs? How do we measure compliance? So we are looking at laws that are trying to develop those frameworks so that we have really, really good information on which to base our policies. And the third is this federalism concern. So that means right, there's this tension between what's happening at the national level with the Trump administration's somewhat, I think, reasonable to say, skepticism and anti-renewable sentiment that's there versus what's happening in Vermont, where we want to keep going with the climate work that we've been working on so far. Next slide, please. With those in mind, we have a bunch of pieces of legislation that are important to track. I just want to mention two things. I'm going to go through this with a really broad stroke, but if you look next to each bill title, there's a number. You can also look for more information on the General Assembly's website. First up, we have single plant, which basically alter the definition of plant for solar and renewable energy facilities that can now site more generating capacity on a single plot of land. Before, the law really disallowed that and did not allow multiple small solar sites to be sited next to each other for fear that they'd be called a single plant. We wanted to reform that so that we could make sure that already disturbed land, which was prime for solar siting, was used and aligns with a lot of the work that towns are already doing. That passed out of the Senate, out of the House, and is now in Senate Finance. Next, we have net metering, which was an attempt by the legislature to prevent net metering compensation decreases. Every 2 years, the Public Utility Commission sets the rates for how much utilities can pay people with rooftop solar or solar mounted on the ground nearby their home for excess generation. We want to make sure with the removal of the federal tax credit that we aren't disincentivizing solar deployment within the state. That has not moved, but um, we are going to be advocating for a not a decrease when that process gets underway in April with the PUC's recommendation. Next, data centers. This has been a big deal across the country. Many states are enacting different kinds of legislation to either disincentivize or incentivize or just heavily regulate would-be data centers. We have a bill that is working its way through the House, which would essentially, what we're focusing on is ensuring that they bring their own energy, that they're not having detrimental impacts to Vermont families and businesses, while also ensuring that whatever the PUC's regulation is going to actually hold up in any court proceeding. So that looks like it's going well. Hasn't passed out of the House, but they're already starting to take it up in the Senate because we see a lot of consensus around that need. Next, we have GHG reporting. This is a, a, a piece of legislation that would allow the Agency of Natural Resources to stand up a greenhouse gas emissions reporting requirement that would cover all emission types from all fuel suppliers at a more granular level than we have right now. So at the county and zip code level, we right now rely on a lot of approximations and estimations, but this would give us some really important data on which to build a program like a cap and invest program. It's important to note that this was one of the top 10 recommendations of the climate action plan that came out over the summer. It was stripped of its $500,000 of appropriated funds in House appropriations, but we still think that this is going to go. It was just up, it's still in the House, going up for a third reading in the coming days. Portable solar, also known as balcony or balcony solar. This is allows an installation of one of those small, single panel solar portable devices that you could put on your balcony or you could put on your uh, porch without having to go to the PUC to get some certificate of public good. So long as it's within that certain size range. That passed easily out of the Senate and is now in House Energy, where the testimony is being taken this week. Next, we have appliance efficiency standards, which essentially just is meant to update Vermont's appliance efficiency standards to match what is currently in the federal regulations. There's some uh, legal technicalities there, but essentially the idea here is we want to have Vermont comply with the strictest form of appliance efficiency standards in case there's any federal backsliding, which we can all imagine may happen in the near term. Next, we have the residential building and commercial building energy standards administration and enforcement. This would basically allow municipalities to enforce those RBs and CBs at their level, and also gives the Division of Fire Safety jurisdiction over how to handle that. Right now, it's kind of there's some ambiguity there. That was just heard in the House, still there. That's also going on to a third reading. Next, and finally, we have the Ratepayer Protection Act. That would require the PUC to adopt rules to stop disconnections during extreme heats and also make sure that the PUC is giving, or the utilities are giving, due deference to medical judgment when we're thinking about what that disconnection period is based on a health hazard. So if you're particularly exposed to extreme heat or extreme cold, we want to make sure that those disconnections are maybe prolonged beyond what is currently available. Next slide, please. And finally, just trying to just talk about sometimes it's about what doesn't pass. We have something about nuclear. There was a law that was passed or not passed that was put forward, H601, that would essentially do two things that we were pretty alarmed by. One, it would remove the General Assembly's authority to approve new nuclear facilities being constructed in the state. It would also open up Vermont Yankees spent fuel storage site to store fuel off-site from off-site, both from Vermont and outside of the state. We also were concerned that in Senate Ag, there was a provision in the miscellaneous ag bill that would basically all but ensure that solar could not be sited on agricultural lands if it was larger than 1 megawatt, which would basically be not feasible for developers. That provision was stripped after some really great testimony from folks like Rev and VPIRG and VNRC. So finally, it's important to just for folks to know on this last slide that, and if you can go to the next slide, please. It's just important for us all to know that we are constantly defending against any disruptions or revocations of the Global Warming Solutions Act. That act, which converted aspirational climate reduction, emissions reductions into legal obligations, is what underpins both the Climate Action Plan, but also programs involving energy efficiency, our renewable energy standard, clean transportation, as well as all forms of agency planning. And so that's something we're really focused on as advocates in the State House and in regulated spaces. I know that was a little bit long and a lot of talking, but there's a lot going on, so we really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much, Adam. And yes, there is a lot, and we're happy if Adam agrees to share those slides and happy to answer any questions and follow up on any of those issues because there is a lot and we need you all engaged in these issues. So, and there's a lot happening in the land use arena. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to my colleague Katie Gallagher to tell us what's happening with smart growth and transportation. Thanks so much, Katie.
Thanks, Joey. Hi, everyone. So as Joey mentioned, I work with the Vermont Natural Resources Council directing our Sustainable Communities program. And as part of that role, I also um, have the pleasure of being the coordinator of a coalition called the Transportation for Vermonters Coalition. So I'll talk more about that in a second, but I'm going to talk about transportation with those two hats on. But first, we're going to start on the smart growth side of things. So Evelyn, if you could go to the next slide, please. Um, so we're going to start with S325. There's really kind of two big bills that we're focused on this session. So the first is one that is the land use piece. It is primarily making updates to Act 181, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And then I'll move on to the transportation side and the transportation budget, also known as the T-bill. Next slide, please. So before jumping into S325, which is what's being worked on right now, for folks who are less familiar with Act 181, which is what S325 is working to address. Act 181 was passed in 2024. This was a really significant overhaul to Vermont's whole planning framework from the local to the state level and trying to make sure that both where we say we want development and where we want conservation, that's all kind of aligned, as well as being aligned with our regulations and our state incentives. So kind of piecing all those things together, which it's kind of a no-brainer. But it also worked to update Act 250, which folks probably know as Vermont's uh, law regulating land use through an environmental and community perspective. It's been in place for over 50 years, and a big part of that was, again, trying to more effectively um, uh, regulate how we are planning for both conservation and for development. And so I can get into more details about that, but to stay high level, that's kind of the big picture of what Act 181 did. Um, because it was such a major reform, the legislature is now considering S325. So this is trying to make some more targeted amendments to ensure that Act 181 has the time to be implemented thoughtfully and effectively and make some kind of important technical corrections and other provisions to make things move as smoothly as possible. Next slide, please. So the first piece is really about more time. A lot of, or not a lot, but there were some key pieces in Act 181 related to the environmental protections that were left open in Act 181 so that it would go through a public process and that the Land Use Review Board, which is this new entity that is managing Act 250, would be able to have more time than the legislature would have to actually figure out the details about what's known as the road rule, which was actually previously in Act 250 for a couple decades, so it's being reintroduced, and Tier 3, which you might have heard about both of these. Tier 3 is more narrowly targeted at very specific natural resources of statewide concern. And so there's been, um, uh, if you've heard about either of these things, there's been a lot of kind of news circulating more recently, but a big part of why there's been a lot of discussion is because both of these are still going through rulemaking and guidance. And so S325 is trying to give more time so that those processes are hearing from everybody, getting that feedback to make sure that the rules are actually um, doing what is intended and not having unintended consequences. Um, the other piece, just to note, is that it is clarifying and making really clear that the Land Use Review Board has certain authority that Act 181 was trying to give them, but this is specific to the idea that for both the road rule and Tier 3, that if Act 250 is triggered by these uh, mechanisms that it might not be all of Act 250 that needs to be applied in order to reach the goal of protecting these specific natural resources. It might just be one criteria that needs to be looked at, for example. So this clarifies that the Land Use Review Board has the authority to narrow that review. Next slide, please. So it also is very much related to housing. So S325 works to reduce the regulatory barriers, and really what it is trying to address is that Act 250 was put into place at a time when a lot of Vermont towns didn't have planning and zoning. Now many do. And so we are trying to reduce any kind of duplicative review to support housing in areas that make the most sense because the towns have planning and zoning, they have infrastructure, they have the capacity for infrastructure. And we're also trying to specifically support priority housing projects, which supports affordable housing. And again, I can get into more details there, but to keep us moving along, um, the other piece that it is addressing is local appeals. It's um, is asking for a study to try to reduce delays, particularly caused by discretionary review and what could be an appeal based on those kind of subjective pieces. Next slide, please. So the bill's also trying to strengthen the planning that is currently going on with the regional planning commissions and their member towns. Um, I think most, if not all, regional planning commissions have started this process of working with their towns to update the regional plans, but it also is having towns define their areas planned for growth and whether they want to opt into these new exemption areas for Act 250, and that's known as the Tier 1 areas. Um, S325 is trying to build in a little bit more flexibility and expanding where growth can happen, and particularly looking at new community centers. So, for example, where a community has their historic downtown along a river corridor and they've been subject to ongoing flooding and they are considering moving their community center. This would allow them to do that and move out from the historic center. Next section, please. So where things stand right now, it has moved through the Senate process. It's going to be on the Senate floor for a vote potentially in about half an hour, but it will be voted on this week. Um, and it's really so after the Senate, it will go to the House, and we anticipate there will still be some changes and lots of discussion in the House as well. But as I just mentioned, the implementation of Act 181 is still very much ongoing, both related to those the road rule and Tier 3 pieces, as well as the regional and town planning and growth area identification pieces. So if you haven't heard about this going on in your town, I would encourage you to reach out to either your planning commission or your regional planning commission or your select board, because this is a great opportunity to get involved in the process and have your input heard. So let's move on to the transportation bill. Sorry for kind of a big change here. Um, so we are I'm gonna, this is a little, how do I want to frame this? A little more scattered. Transportation policy functions a bit differently, in that we end up putting a lot of policies into what is known as the T-bill. This is both the transportation policy and largely the transportation budget. So it ends up being this very large bill. It's based off of the governor's proposed budget. So we're always kind of just trying to make amendments to what was proposed by the administration. The big goals that we have, I'd say, speaking from both VNRC's perspective as well as the Transportation for Vermonters Coalition, is that our transportation fund is really kind of in free fall right now. And that is due to several different reasons. It's something that's happening across the country. The legislature has recognized this for many years. We've had many studies that have looked at new potential funding mechanisms to fill that gap, but there has been no action, and that kind of continues to be the trend this year right now. The T-bill always starts in the House, and so now that are midway through the session, the House is finalizing the T-bill. It hasn't been voted out of the House yet, but we expect that to happen soon. And beyond broader funding, a lot of what we are focused on is public transit, street safety, and having more opportunities for towns to implement walking and biking and opportunities for using the streets safely, and vehicle electrification and access to EVs and other electric mobility like e-bikes. So next slide, please. So just to run through these really quickly, actually, so this slide is Transportation for Vermonters' 5 key policy priorities for this year. I'm going, because I feel like I've been talking for too long already, so I'm going to skip past this and go to transit, which has been a really key priority for a couple of years now because our transit service, both in the urban area of Chittenden County and Green Mountain Transit, which serves largely Chittenden County and some surrounding areas, although their service has changed recently, and our rural areas, they are facing major funding challenges, again, similar to across the country. With transit, we have something that is known as a death spiral, which is when we start cutting services, it is really difficult to get those back. And when you start cutting services, people are less likely to take the bus, especially if they don't need to take the bus. And so then we have less ridership. And so then those routes aren't doing as well. We get less funding from the federal government. And so that's where we start spiraling down. So, Green Mountain Transit has already started to make cuts over the past couple of years. They are looking to cut up to 30% of their routes potentially. And so have been calling for increased funding for both Green Mountain Transit and our rural transit providers to try to avoid this transit death spiral. The current T-bill draft does not really close this gap, so transit service still remains at risk, but we are continuing to talk about it and hopefully we'll make some waves in the Senate. Next slide, please. So you may have heard that the state cut pretty much all the funding for our electric vehicle incentives and EV charging. So we had asked in the beginning of the session to just really narrowly restore the funding for specifically the Mileage Smart program for EVs and the e-bike incentives, both of which were really supportive of getting lower income Vermonters into electric mobility options. Um, that has not yet happened, but again, still kind of high on our priority list. We also were advocating for restoring funding for Drive Electric Vermont, which, if you've ever been in the market for an EV or looked around, they're that really fantastic source of education and information about EVs. We were able to get funding in for Drive Electric in the House version of the T-bill, although not all of the funding that we would like. And then finally, looking for right to charge, which is allowing for residents of, say, a condo association to be able to install EV charging at their homes. Next slide, please. So more on the active transportation side, we are focused on really trying to just get street safety and flexibility for municipalities um, moving forward as less money asked as we can, knowing that we're in a tough budget year. One of those is just shifting how we fund a specific program to get more money for biking and walking. That's a fund that comes from the federal government. We also are asking to allow towns to set speed limits lower than 25 miles per hour. Right now, there's very limited exemptions and areas where towns can do so, and only a couple towns. So giving towns more authority, and then similarly giving towns more authority to expand a uh, a local option tax. So more and more towns are implementing local option taxes. That's a 1% tax locally. They get a certain percentage of that back. So we are interested in allowing towns to raise that to 2% so that they could have more money locally, ideally to help fill some of those transportation gaps that now towns are seeing as VTrans is cutting funding for projects. Um, so we've gotten some progress on this. This is my kind of sideways thumb, but still work needing to be done in the House. Next slide, please. So, where things stand now, we have, again, some progress, but definitely some key gaps remain, in particular, that funding shortfall, both for public transit specifically and the general transportation fund in general, really needs to, probably isn't going to be resolved this session, but it really needs to have some serious thought behind it and some serious action. Um, Especially when it comes to stabilizing transit, advancing electrification, improving street safety, walking and biking infrastructure, local funding, all of these things really need stronger support. I will just leave you on personal advocacy that our lawmakers really aren't hearing, I think, as much as they should from constituents on the need to better fund transportation. This is a really, really big issue. You may have seen more news coming out about towns, for example, that are kind of giving back ownership of local roads because they can't afford to maintain them. And there's a whole host of different impacts that I think we're going to start feeling more and more on the ground. And as transportation is our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, this is a really key climate issue as well that has multiple co-benefits that kind of can bring in a lot of different partners in a really exciting way, but we need funding to actually make that happen. Okay, I think that is it for me. Thank you.
Whew. Katie, thank you so much. That is so much, and it's all very important. So really appreciate you sort of getting through that all. And we want to get through other important content and get to some questions. So appreciate that, Katie. Please continue to drop any other questions in the chat. We're going to aim to get to them. But without further ado, I'm excited to turn it over to Justin Marsh, who is Vermont Conservation Voters Political Director. And Justin is going to give us some highlights on what's happening with other really important issues and priorities of the Common Agenda related to climate resilience, food security, toxics, and democracy. So Justin, thanks so much. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Johanna, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So I am pinch hitting for Lauren Hurl, Executive Director of VNRC, who is over in the State House, I believe. So I'm going to go over her notes and then I'll transition to the stuff that I know a little bit more about. And I'm going to try to do it quickly. And I have no slides prepared. I'm so sorry. You just have to stare at my face. But please drop any questions and we will hopefully have enough time to get to it. So to go over the climate resilience and food security issues. As you've been hearing a lot, it's this time of year, lots of things are moving, so I'm gonna just try my best to get through it all. There was a proposal to improve the process for moving forward restoration projects. Under current law, if you're doing an ecological restoration project as like a dam removal project, you need to essentially go through the same permitting process that you would if you're doing a developmental project. So even though you're restoring the environment, the process is the same as if you're potentially damaging the environment. So we had proposed that the Agency of Natural Resources create an updated permit process to make it easier and quicker to move through the approval process for restoration projects. There was bill language proposed, and ultimately ANR committed to taking these steps themselves without requiring a statutory change. Ultimately, we believe a new law would give us a better backstop if they don't move this forward, but it doesn't need statutory change to happen. The House Environment Committee agreed with ANR's plan to undertake the work, and the House Environment Chair, Rep. Amy Sheldon, submitted a letter outlining her expectations for the program and to ensure that it happens in a timely manner. We will be watchdogging that process to make sure that they make progress so we can take out more dams, restore more floodplains and wetlands, and generally do more ecological restoration projects. But we think this is a step forward for progress. Next, I'm going to talk about a bill to reduce chloride pollution, which was S218. This is a legislative conversation that actually started last year, but it ran out of time and it was picked up early this year and got momentum. So the bill creates a chloride contamination reduction program that will educate, train, and certify salt applicators about best practices to reduce road salt and adopt best management practices, and several other provisions to ensure that we maintain safe roads while reducing the amount of salt being applied. That is a voluntary program. Road salt, as we know it, is a useful tool for maintaining pedestrian and driver safety because it effectively melts snow and ice, but it also damages the environment and infrastructure. A study by the Journal of Environmental Management in 2024 recognized chloride as a contaminant in the Lake Champlain Basin, which provides drinking water for roughly 150,000 Vermonters. Chloride infiltrates water supplies and can corrode pipes, causing an increase in heavy metals and lead in drinking water, including well water. When chloride seeps into our surface water, its toxicity impacts invertebrates, fish, amphibians, and plants as well. Lawmakers agreed that this is an issue that we should address, and the bill passed the Senate 29-1 and is currently being taken up by the House Environment Committee. Related to conservation, there has been legislative conversations around protecting more wildlands, studying the reintroduction of catamounts, and phasing out toxic rodenticides, which I will get to in a minute. And all of those have stalled, but we anticipate conversations will continue in the future. In the Environmental Common Agenda, we also called for lawmakers to fund local food security programs like Three Squares Vermont, Crop Cash, and Farm Share. And as of this week, for Three Squares Vermont, legislators have included full funding, which is $53 million in the House version of the bill, as was included in the governor's recommended budget. This amount includes additional funding for outreach partners. Crop Cash Plus, and Farm Share were funded at $500,000 in one-time funding. We also called to pass the Farm Security Fund, which was S60, to support our farmers and ensure that all Vermonters have access to fresh local food. This bill provides financial assistance to farms that experienced qualifying losses due to climate conditions and weather events. S60 passed the House and Senate and was sent to the governor's desk on Friday, but no funding was appropriated to the fund in the House budget. Language was included in the bill that states the agency does not have to act on this law if no funding is appropriated. The Senate Agriculture Committee has sent a letter to Senate Appropriations asking for $1 million. Partners like NOFA are asking for 15.6. We will stay tuned. That is that part of my ramble. Next, I will move on to toxics. So Vermont is poised to be one of the first states to ban paraquat, which is an acutely toxic herbicide. Multiple National Institutes of Health studies have linked paraquat exposure to Parkinson's disease, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and childhood leukemia. While there is paraquat usage in Vermont due to a reporting loophole from applicators, the data outlining precisely when and where the herbicide has been applied is significantly lacking, which we didn't know until the Committee on Agriculture, Forestry, and Food Resiliency started taking testimony on this. 72 other countries, including China and the entire European Union, have banned this chemical, and what is now known as H7339 strives to do for Vermont is an eventual phase out. Alternatives to paraquat exist, and because of this chemical's extreme toxicity, banning it in Vermont before it becomes widely applied is the safe course of action for Vermonters. And we've even seen since the beginning of the year when testimony began, Syngenta, which is one of the biggest chemical companies in the United States, has stopped getting its license from the federal government to even sell it. So they're phasing themselves out. The bill passed the House in March and is now in the Senate. We also worked on a bill that would ban toxic heavy metals in baby food and formula. So, Vermont's H536 would ban the sale of baby food containing those toxic metals, including lead, arsenic, cadmium, and mercury. And it would require labeling with QR codes linking to product testing data. The legislation is critical because these metals are known neurotoxins that can cause irreversible developmental harm, particularly in infants whose brains and nervous systems are still forming. So, studies have found alarming levels in widely sold commercial baby foods, yet federal standards remain pretty inadequate. So, four other states have passed similar laws: California, Illinois, Virginia, and Maryland. So, we would be the fifth to pass this law. But Vermont's law would be the strongest yet due to its inclusion of infant formula. Where right now the current bill includes a threshold. So if other states came on board, we would go on board with them. We're hoping to make the bill a little bit stronger in the Senate, which it is now headed to. We supported a ban of so-called chemical recycling as part of our broader commitment to protecting Vermonters from toxic chemical exposure and plastic pollution. So, chemical recycling was created by the industry and promoted as a solution to plastic pollution. But in actuality, it's just a polluting practice that poses serious risks to public health and to the environment. So, rather than offering a genuine solution to the plastics crisis, it shifts the burden of harm onto communities while generating toxic byproducts. Vermont has established itself as a national leader in addressing PFAS and plastic pollution, and banning chemical recycling is a natural next step in defending public health and holding polluters accountable. The bill was introduced in a larger bill that stalled in the Senate, but there may be a path to including this language in other bills that still have life. Quickly, rodenticide, which I mentioned, stalled out. Rodenticides poison children, pets, and wildlife, and every year in the US, there are thousands of children and tens of thousands of domestic animals that suffer from poisoning from rodenticides. From 2018 to 2025, the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources found anticoagulant rodenticides in 94% of tested fishers and 70% of tested bobcats on average. Uh, Wildlife rehab centers in New England treat hundreds of rodenticide poisoned wildlife every year, and these wildlife cases are likely only a small fraction of the total wildlife that's impacted by these poisons. Sadly, despite lots of testimony both last year and this year, the bill did not make it past the crossover deadline. So we need a stronger committee. Um, and now shifting to democracy in my final minute, I'll try my best. The Voting Rights Act, which is S298, it modernizes the federal John Lewis Voting Rights Act of 1965 and gives state protection, strengthens voting protections, expands voter access and support, including language assistance, and there's enforcement language against interference and voter intimidation and false election information. The original bill was introduced, and then we introduced another draft that was a little bit stronger, and it kind of lined us up with some other states, including Virginia. But unfortunately, at the last minute, in order to get it out of committee by crossover, it got trimmed. A lot of it, a lot of language was snipped from the bill. So we're left with a pretty anemic bill, I would say right now. But it is in House Government Operations, and we're working with the Secretary of State to get elements returned to that bill to actually make it a Voting Rights Act. As it stands right now, I don't think we could actually call it a Voting Rights Act, but we're working on it. A voter interference bill, H541, strengthens penalties for election interference and expands the scope beyond just polling places, adds civil enforcement and some investigation powers. That passed the House and is now in Senate Judiciary. There's a pair of bills, S208 and S209, that are kind of in response to Trump's second administration and the uptick in ICE presence. 208 is standards for law enforcement identification, and 209 is civil arrests in sensitive locations, basically requiring law enforcement agents to show identification and have their faces shown, and prohibits civil arrests from happening in sensitive locations such as hospitals and schools and polling places. Both passed the Senate on identical votes of 27-2 and are currently in the House Judiciary. Last two, H686 expands identification of lobbying advertisements, basically broadening what a lobbying ad disclosure, what the requirements are for those. And certain advertisements that are intended to influence legislative action would need clear identification that they are from a lobbyist or lobbying firm or a lobbyist employer that who's basically paying them. And it also removes timing restrictions. So we've seen that happen playing out time after time in recent elections. And so we're hoping that that would make it a more even and fair playing field for folks who work in the election space. And that passed the House and is now in the Senate. And finally, S23, which is now Act 75 because it was signed by the governor on March 5th, is a synthetic media and elections bill that would require disclosures when synthetic media, like something that was created by AI, is used deceptively to influence voters. You might have heard fake voices of a politician calling you. Basically, it requires clear disclaimers within 90 days of an election that have to include a clear statement that the media that's used was manipulated or generated by AI. It also includes enforcement and penalty language. And that's that. Thank you all for your patience.
No patience. That was great. Thank you so much. There's a lot happening. And yes, thank you all for sort of bearing with us as we try to cover a ton of content. But there's a lot of really important things happening. And so I wanted to turn it over and just get to some questions. Looks like Armin may have left, but I'm going to ask Adam if you want to tackle the question. There was an editorial about Efficiency Vermont that was dropped in the chat. Not sure if you've read it, but if you have any further context you'd want to lend, that'd be great.
Sorry, technical difficulties. Yeah, I did read it, and I just want to say first that CLF is actively involved as an intervener in the demand resource plan proceeding at the Public Utility Commission, so very familiar with Efficiency Vermont and the two other energy efficiency utilities. And I would say I have multiple responses to this. The first is just to say from the outset, EVT has saved ratepayers collectively more than $3 billion over its lifetime, so it is more than paid for itself. And just a reminder, behind transportation, thermal emissions is the second greatest contributor of greenhouse gases to our environment at approximately 32%. And then to get more granular, one of the things about energy efficiency is the efficiency of Vermont is that it's a highly regulated utility. And so everything that it does is subject to regulatory oversight, and they have to show that everything they do screens as cost effective and cost beneficial. And they have kind of made this case, I think, in a very compelling way that, we have made a lot of the energy efficiency improvements that are low-hanging fruit, like converting lighting to LED, less the need to replace them being much, much less frequent. Now we have to kind of think through investing in energy efficiency programs which are a little bit more complex and a little bit more expensive, things like flexible load management and whole home transformations in addition to weatherizing homes. And that's going to just frankly take more resources. And now is not the time to shrink back. We need to make sure they have the resources to continue to provide that savings to ratepayers across the state. And that's particularly true as we see peak demand as we electrify more. We're going to have to make sure that we can meet that demand at its peak, and that can be really, really expensive. And so every bit that the efficiency utilities can chip away at that, that is just massive savings. And you think about GMP saving, hundreds of millions of dollars using battery storage to meet the peak. I mean, those are really significant. And I just want to say, Efficiency Vermont has developed a really deep expertise in administering and producing energy efficiency programs and often provide resources to the state itself. And so there's this sort of reciprocal relationship that I think we have to acknowledge in developing this really unique, first of a kind energy efficiency utility. And then, of course, just to round it off, EVT is very different than VEIC, which is its parent company, which does a lot of different things around both the country and abroad, as the op-ed notes. But the degree of how much they're doing in those spaces is really relevant and important, and they're saving people money all around the world.
Thank you so much, Adam. I'm going to turn it over to Katie. Couple of questions in the chat related to Act 181. I don't know if you want to paraphrase and aim to tackle them both together. That'd be great. Thank
Sure.
you.
Yeah, so there was a comment about the cost to taxpayers of long driveways and asking about the protest that happened yesterday against Act 181. So, yeah, and I responded in the chat related to driveways. There, private roads and driveways have oftentimes will have fairly significant municipal costs for a variety of reasons, but I think it is often not really understood. But that was one of the key kind of um, economic drivers for the smart growth movement was this economic um, and financial component for municipalities and the cost to them of having sprawling development. And so that's one thing. And just to note on the road rule, it it is the rules again are still being developed around them, but it's generally around a road that's more than 800 feet or a driveway or a combination of driveways and roads that are longer than 2,000 feet. And so if we're talking about a road out to a single family home, that would be a driveway over 2,000 feet. That's a very long driveway. And the goal is not to necessarily have these projects go through Act 250. The goal is that they avoid Act 250 by just having a shorter driveway or road or by clustering those homes through like a planned unit development or something like that. Um, there's oftentimes not actually a necessity for the road to be that long. And a lot of towns, not sure how many in Vermont, but are actually implementing a similar kind of tool through zoning. So this is again, because it has such a municipal impact as well as the environmental impact. And I think in terms of the rally that was at the State House yesterday, folks haven't been aware of this. There's been a lot of news recently about rural Vermonters in particular who have been raising a lot of questions and concerns about the rollout of Act 181 and in particular the road rule and Tier 3 pieces. And as I might have mentioned in my presentation, one challenge is that they're going through a public process right now, and so they aren't settled. And the um, I think there's kind of a worst case assumption being made, and it's difficult to say, well, no, that's not going to happen because the rules just haven't been done yet, even though we are fairly confident that the intent is not that any development, the development of a shed or of an ADU on your home in a large parcel is going to trigger the road rule, for example. There were initial maps that were shared that were very broad. We are not supporting those maps, but we know that the Land Use Review Board is still working through the process and hearing public comments. And I think in our conversations with legislators, that's a lot of what we're hearing is that they, having talked to the Land Use Review Board, having talked to folks on the ground, um, know that there is this process that is happening. I think that it is challenging when it can seem like it's a little bit behind the curtain, even though it is a public process. But of course, most of us don't have the time or capacity to be plugged into these things all day, and there's so many different things going on. So, um, all that to say, I think that there are legitimate questions and concerns that are being raised and that are being heard. At the same time, we know that there's the kind of lot of stoking of fear and misinformation that's happening at the same time. But we think that S325 will be helpful in delaying some of those timelines, adding in some of those kind of narrow provisions to give us the time and space to have those public conversations a bit more thoroughly. And the legislators are feeling confident as well that the bill is helping to address a lot of those concerns that are being raised. I'll just note VNRC has put up a couple different materials on our website over the past week or two related to Act 181 and S325. So if you have more questions, feel free to take a look there, but also very happy to answer any questions via email or offline because, as I said, this is definitely complicated stuff.
Thank you so much, Katie. Complicated and really important. So very much appreciate that. We're coming up on the hour. I wanted to close with three important things for you all. First, I want to ask Adam Aguirre briefly to give an update on the Climate Super Fund, and there's a hearing on this important policy on Monday. Adam, just give us a quick update on the polluter pays effort.
Yeah, so for those who are unfamiliar, I'm sure most here are, in 2024, Vermont passed the Climate Superfund law, which essentially seeks to hold the largest fossil fuel companies financially kind of responsible for helping to mitigate the damage caused by their use of their product. That has been challenged, of course, by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Petroleum Institute, and the federal government. Conservation Law Foundation is a defendant intervener, so we are working kind of alongside with the state of Vermont to defend the suit. And there's a hearing. It's the first, it's basically whether or not this lawsuit can continue. There will be a hearing on Monday at 10 a.m. It's happening at the federal court down in Rutland, but there's also there will be a video link, and I don't have it available right now, but we might be able to provide that for those who are interested in hearing. It is the first of its kind. It will get a lot of media attention, so you will definitely hear about it, but could be really interesting to watch firsthand.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Adam. I also wanted to just note that and put on your radar for an opportunity to come together in person. Um, on April 11th for the Vermont Changemakers Summit. I'm going to drop the registration in the chat. It's going to be a great day. It's all about a variety of different organizations and Vermonters coming together to strategize and think about how we can collaborate in new and different ways in solidarity in terms of responding to what's happening at the federal level. Thanks, Jack, for dropping that in the chat. Just hot off the presses, we learned that Congresswoman Ballant is going to be there along with Secretary of State Sarah Copeland-Hanzas and our Treasurer Mike Pichek. So it's going to be a great day and we need you all. So please join us on April 11th. And in the meantime, huge thanks to our speakers who we asked to lift a lot in a little amount of time, and to you all for joining us on a beautiful Wednesday afternoon over your lunch hour. There's a lot happening, and yet so much that's still deeply unsettling and disconcerting and could have long-standing consequences if we don't act in solidarity. So keep on and keep in touch. Thanks to everyone for everything you're doing and big team effort. We'll look forward to following up and hopefully see you on April 11th. So thank you all again, and thanks again to our panelists for your presentations and your work. Have a good day, everyone. Thanks much.